Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty amazing, a region most people probably haven't even heard of, but it's this hidden world bursting with life. And it's older, can you believe it? Older than the Himalayas.
Older than the Himalayas, we're talking about the Western Ghats of India.
The Western Ghats, and this isn't just some random mountain range, right? We're talking UNESCO World Heritage Site level important.
Absolutely, and for good reason. I mean, you're talking about one of the most incredible biodiversity hotspots on the entire planet.
So break it down for us. Just how biodiverse are we talking? Paint a picture. What kind of numbers are we dealing with here?
Okay, so picture this. Over 5,000 different species of plants, almost 200 types of amphibians, and a huge chunk of those found nowhere else on Earth.
Wow, nowhere else on Earth. Okay, so we're talking rare, we're talking unique. But why should the average person care about a few unique species of, like, frogs halfway around the world?
Well, first of all, it's about a lot more than just frogs, right? The Western Ghats are directly connected to the lives of 250 million people in India.
250 million? That's what, like the population of some entire countries?
Exactly. And it's not just about water, though that's obviously huge. But think about it. These mountains actually influence the monsoon, the rainfall that impacts agriculture for the entire Indian peninsula.
So it's like this chain reaction. You mess with the Western Ghats, you mess with the entire region's climate.
Essentially, and not to mention, they act as a massive carbon sink, so they're playing a key role in fighting climate change, too.
It's like this hidden world holding a much bigger piece of the puzzle than we realize.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole region so fascinating and honestly crucial to understand, especially when you start to factor in that humans have been a part of this whole ecosystem for a very long time.
Right, because this isn't like some untouched wilderness, right? We're talking about a place with a really long history of human interaction.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about evidence of humans living in the Western Ghats, get this, going back over 12,000 years.
12,000 years. That's a long time for humans and nature to, figure out how to live together for better or for worse.
Exactly.
So how did that relationship evolve over time? Paint us a picture. How did humans interact with the Western Ghats over the centuries?
Well, you have to start with the earliest inhabitants, right? You had hunter-gatherer groups. They lived in a way that was more in tune with the natural rhythms of the region, but that doesn't mean their impact was insignificant. Then things started to shift, especially during the colonial period.
The colonial period, yeah. I was wondering when that would come into play. How did that impact things in the Western Ghats?
Well, you see this more extractive mindset start to take hold, right? Large-scale agriculture, you've got commercial plantations popping up left and right, resource extraction. It's all about profit, often at the expense of the environment.
Sadly, that's not a new story.
It's a pattern we've seen repeat itself throughout history, and while India's independence obviously brought its own changes, the pressure on the Western Ghats has only intensified. More people, more development, more demand, it all adds up.
Which leads us to the heart of why we're here today, right? It sounds like the Western Ghats are at this crucial point, stuck between this incredible ecological importance and the very real pressures of a growing human population.
I think that's a good way to put it, and that's precisely why the document we're diving into today is so important.
You're talking about the joint response from the VT Center for Legal Policy and the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, ATREE for short, to the Indian government's latest attempt to designate the Western Ghats as an ecologically sensitive area, an ESA.
Exactly. And it's not just about protecting a few plants and animals. It's about figuring out how 250 million people and one of the most biodiverse places on Earth can actually share the same space.
No small task, that's for sure. So let's dig in, shall we? What are some of the biggest things this document is hoping to address? So this ESA thing, it's kind of like drawing a line in the sand, right?
Yeah.
Certain things are just like non-starters if you want to protect this place.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. They're saying some things are just flat out too damaging to even consider, like big dams. No way.
Makes sense, especially with everything we just talked about, the water, the monsoon, the whole interconnected system. But they go even further, right? Mining, not just regulating it, but totally banning it outright.
Exactly. Then there's a reason for that. When you look at the Western Ghats specifically, you've got these incredibly fragile soils, super prone to erosion already. You add in the steep slopes and the rainfall. It's like a recipe for disaster if you start digging things up on a massive scale.
So mining in that environment, it's not just about what comes out of the ground. It's about what happens to the ground itself, right? Landslides, pollution, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. The document makes it clear that the risks Especially the long-term risks to the environment far outweigh any of the short-term economic benefits mining might bring. And they back that up with case studies from other places where mining has just been devastating, just not worth it.
Bold move, for sure. But it's not like they're saying no development whatsoever, right? People live in the Western Ghats. They rely on it. So how does the document handle that balancing act, allowing some level of progress while protecting such a fragile ecosystem?
That's where the rubber meets the road. The document gets really specific about how to manage things that are allowed, but only with super strict oversight. We're not just talking vague suggestions here.
Give us an example. Where do they really hammer home this need for regulation?
Public consultation is a big one. They're basically saying you can't have any project with even the potential to impact the Western Ghats without involving local communities every step of the way.
And not just like a quick, hey, we're doing this, but like really bringing them into the decision-making process.
100%. And the reason for that, they argue, is local communities, they have this deep well of knowledge you just can't get from a map or a research study. They understand how the ecosystem works in a way outsiders might miss.
Generations of lived experience, knowing the land like the back of their hand.
Exactly. And it's about respecting their right to have a say in what happens in their own backyard.
So it's about responsible development, not just development for development's sake.
Right. It has to work for everyone, including the environment. And on that note, they also talk about something called cumulative impact assessments, CIAs.
Okay, now you're getting technical on me. What are CIAs all about?
Yeah.
So CIAs, it's like, instead of just looking at one project in isolation, you have to think long term. What happens if everyone starts doing this one little thing?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that small impacts can add up to something much bigger over time. They actually use the example of small hydropower projects in the document, like one or two, maybe not a huge deal on their own, but what happens when you've got dozens of them scattered throughout the Western Ghats, all pulling water from the same rivers, the same ecosystems. It's a recipe for disaster if you don't consider the big picture.
Yeah, it's like death by 1,000 cuts, right? Individually, maybe not a huge deal, but together. So how do you actually make sure something like this ESA actually has teeth? That it's not just like words on paper?
Well, one of the most concrete recommendations in the document is to create a dedicated decision support and monitoring center, specifically for the Western Ghats.
So basically like an independent watchdog making sure everyone's playing by the rules. What would that look like on a day-to-day basis?
Think of it like this. Every project, every proposal, anything that could impact the Western Ghats, this center would review it, make sure it aligns with the ESA guidelines, make sure there aren't any hidden consequences they're missing. And then, beyond just the initial approval, they'd be responsible for ongoing monitoring, keeping an eye on the ecosystem's health.
So checking for red flags, making sure things aren't going sideways. What kind of stuff would they actually be tracking?
Everything. Water quality, deforestation rates. How are the different species doing? Are the conservation efforts working? Are there new threats popping up? They even talk about monitoring social indicators like how are the local communities doing? Are they benefiting from this approach? It's very holistic.
Wow. So it's not just about protecting the environment. It's about making sure those protections actually work for the people who live there too. That's a pretty important distinction.
Absolutely. And the document is very upfront about the fact that this won't be easy. They're talking about setting up permanent monitoring stations, doing regular impact assessments, both ecological and social. And they stress the importance of making sure the local communities have the resources and the training to participate in the whole process.
A big lift, for sure. But it's kind of refreshing to see a document that doesn't just say, we need to protect this place, but actually takes the next step and tries to map out how you actually do that.
Right, and that's why I think this document is so interesting, even beyond the specifics of the Western Ghats. It's like a case study in how to approach conservation in a world that's changing faster than ever, where there are no easy answers. It's about understanding that you need collaboration, compromise, and this willingness to adapt, to learn as you go.
It's about realizing that we're all connected, right?
Yeah.
What happens in the Western Ghats, it doesn't just stay there, it ripples out.
Exactly. The choices we make today, they have consequences for the environment, for the people who call it home, even for those of us halfway across the world. The story of the Western Ghats, it's still being written, and it's up to us to decide what the ending will be.
And that, I think, is a pretty good place to leave it for today.